Advising clients across Cape Cod and across the country. Here he is, your host, J. Christopher Boyd.
Hi everybody, Chris Boyd here with something more for your financial well-being. One of the things we run into a lot for clients is the question of how much cash is appropriate to retain in their portfolio or just as a whole, whether it's in their investments or in the bank. So the first question that kind of comes up is, why have cash reserves at all? And particularly in a low interest rate environment, I'm not making any money per se on the money I keep in the bank or in a checking account, savings account doesn't pay much. Should I really have much cash? And so what's the reason? The reason is liquidity. There are times when it really does pay off, it's beneficial to have some reserves available to deal with the unexpected expenses that arise, whether it's problems with your car, or the home needs repairs, or maybe there's healthcare costs that come up. Additionally, for people in retirement, there are times when it's really inopportune to pull funds from your investments. So having a good cash reserve can be a really good idea, preventing you from having to take money from your investments at a bad time. We know we want to sell high, not low. So how much is the right amount of cash to retain? Well, this is of course a personal question, and it differs from one person to the next, so it's very difficult to answer this with an absolute. But there are some rules of thumbs. And we do talk about the flinch factor or the sleep factor. How much can you keep without losing sleep at night? You need to have some reserve in there because it'll help you sleep at night. If you have not enough, it may cause you anxiety. So as opposed to the investment holdings that do have volatility and that are inevitably going to have those kinds of issues. So what are some of these rules of thumb? For pre-retirees, we tend to think in terms of an ideal would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 months of expenses readily accessible. That may or may not be enough, but that 3 to 6 months is kind of the number that is often talked about. If you have a disability or a layoff, that can help you get through it, but clearly it's not enough for a long-term kind of concern. For people in retirement, post-retirement, we tend to think in terms of 1 to 3 years of expenses. That sounds like a lot, and I'll put a caveat to that. We tend to think of those expenses less the amount of fixed income resources, and by fixed resources, by that I mean Social Security, pension, things like that. So if we take what your monthly expenses are and subtract those fixed figures out, that's going to diminish how much we want, but we want at least 1 year, maybe as much as 3 years of available funds. So that can help, particularly, again, if it's a bad time to pull from the investments. That can give you the opportunity to ride out some of those bumps in the road. When we think about this with our clients, we often talk about a bucket approach, where we want some money in guaranteed investments, bank kind of money. We want some money with a modest level of risk. And then there are other types of investments that we think of that are going to be the more risk-oriented things that are in line with whatever your temperament allows. There's virtue to having this kind of graduated approach because it gives you a pecking order of where you might go when you need to have funds, whether it's for regular things or the unexpected. So one of the things that oftentimes comes up is people sometimes think about using equity lines or reverse mortgage in lieu of having cash. And there's a good argument for that at times, but we generally are cautious about this approach because one thing is it can make you think you have more available funds, more investments than you actually do if you're not taking into account that leverage, that liability that you are offsetting some of your investments with. For particularly in the case of a home equity line, that has a 10-year timeline, and at some point it's due, and you're going to have to make that money available or turn it into a loan. So generally we don't think along those lines. Reverse mortgages can have some virtues, particularly in this fashion where it can provide liquidity that you draw from your portfolio in good times, but in bad times you could draw from that reverse mortgage. But most investors tend to shy away from that as their primary plan, so we tend not to think about that. And there are times when people do have cash reserves that are sufficient, but they want to still make a little bit more, so there may be some sort of happy medium that you can think about. In any case, the bottom line is finding a balance is the ideal. We got to look for opportunities we don't want that opportunity risk, having too much sitting idle and not making enough for us, and yet at the same time we do need to have money available when it's required. So that's hopefully a little bit of help to you in thinking about how much cash reserve to retain as you think about your financial planning.